Okay.
All right. So, as part of kind of our initiative to learn more about each other and share that amongst ourselves as well as with the rest of the wider Westar community, I wanted to kind of talk to some of our members and scholars and get their work and their experience out there. So, for anyone who doesn't know by now, my name is Alexis Waggoner, and I am the Marketing and Education Director for Westar. And today I am talking to Dan Peterson. And Dan, I think, has kind of an interesting story because you are currently a pastor. You also have a PhD scholarship background. You have done some interesting work on Tillich, and you have a systematic theology background. So I'd love to hear kind of a little bit of your story and how you got from kind of scholarship to ministry and back and forth and those sorts of elements. So feel free to kind of share whatever you've done and where you've been and where you're going.
Well, I don't know how to answer the last, but I'll try the first couple. I was in seminary before I decided to go on to do a PhD. My background is Lutheran Christian, and my guess is that my status as a pastor, but also with the academic work I've done, makes me fairly unique in the Westar community, particularly the God Seminar. But I did a PhD in systematic and philosophical theology and wrote my dissertation on the concept of the hiddenness of God in Western Christianity, and that sort of precipitated my interest subsequently in death of God theology. So after my PhD, I went and taught for 4 years at one university and then for 7 years at another. And it was at the first of these that I met Mike Zabarchuk, who ended up being my colleague and my co-editor for a book we compiled together called Resurrecting the Death of God, which came out in 2014. And what I realized in that process was that my interest was both academic and pastoral, for lack of a better word, that I was really interested in looking at the intersection between the academy and the church and what Christian faith might look like in an increasingly secular age. There's lots of talk, even among members in the God Seminar, that religion is making a comeback. I'm not necessarily convinced it is. I'm more sympathetic to Bonhoeffer, who in the 1940s wrote about Christianity in a world come of age, in a world that had found its way without recourse to God. And then in the context of 1960s American radical theology, which appropriated some of Bonhoeffer's later writings, what it meant to write in a context, as William Hamilton put it, where it wasn't just the neurotic few who had learned to live without God, but many people. I think we're in another one of those, maybe you could call them secular waves. And I'm interested in finding a kind of faith expression that makes sense in that context. And so a little over 2 years ago, I decided, after having spent 11 years in the academy, to see what this might look like in the parish.
Yeah.
And so for the last 2 or 2.5 years, this has been, in some ways, both a call to ministry, I hope, but also a kind of experiment to see what radical theology looks like in one of the most secular cities of the country, Seattle, where I live, and in a denomination that has lost over 1 million members since the early 1990s.
Yeah.
And what I'm finding so far is totally inconclusive. It's very difficult doing ministry here, and it's very difficult trying to find ways that the claims of various radical theologians, again going back to the 1960s and before them Bonhoeffer, meet folks in the pews.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at. I find this kind of work fascinating, and I was invited by Mike and by Jeff Robbins, whose work I became familiar with about a decade ago. And then as we were starting to put together this Death of God book, he ended up being one of the contributors. And I have a lot of respect for him, for Clayton Crockett and others, and the kind of work that they're doing that are in this kind of radical theology field, if you will. And so Jeff ultimately then invited me into the seminar, and I'm really enjoying it so far.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I know it is. I concur with all that you've said. And I think that, and obviously that's one of Westar's huge missions and jobs, to kind of get this stuff out to the people. But I think it's unique that you are actually doing that. I know there's a couple, like Robin Myers is another one that's a minister as well, that's on the God Seminar, but to actually hear how you've kind of tried or at least thought through some of those translation issues in terms of the work that we're doing on these committee or on these seminars actually translate. So I'm, you kind of alluded to it that it's still a work in progress, but I'm curious of, kind of maybe some of the stuff you've tried or some of the things ways that you've melded both your academic experience and now the ministerial experience and I don't know, like what you would suggest or not suggest.
Right. Yeah, there's probably a longer list of what I wouldn't suggest at this point. But just a couple things here. First of all, one of the things that I really appreciated when I started attending some of Westar's events was the format that you have, such that you have a group of lay observers, and then the experts, the specialists is a better word. In these particular areas, you invite conversation from both parties, and I think that that's really something that I want to see more. And I want to see it more in the parish where I serve, in particular, and in the church to which I belong. I'd like to see more of those kinds of engagements. So I like that format, and it's a draw for me to the Westar group. Had a chance to work with Bob Miller, writing an article for the 4th R on what Death of God theology means, and again enjoyed that kind of translating work. And that's why I wrote the book that I did on Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich, for me, as a college freshman many years ago, helped me to see that, as he says in his book, The Dynamics of Faith, that serious doubt is a confirmation of faith. And that was really an opening for me. And Tillich helped make the Christian faith intellectually compelling to me. And so I think if it wasn't for Tillich at that stage in my journey, I would very likely not be in the church.
Wow.
But Tillich, and then subsequently Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then a host of other theologians, D'Artazola, the mystics in the Western tradition, etc. I would say, in terms of what's worked and what hasn't, I'm not sure that all self-professed seekers are seekers. And I'm not sure that there are as many seekers as we'd like to think there are. What I'm learning is that in many ways, Death of God or radical theology, at least in some of its classical expressions, is kind of parasitic on theism. And I see this as well in the work of people like, not in American radical theology, but Lloyd Gearing, for example, who's a popular name in the Westar Institute. Much of what he's doing, I think, draws upon kind of theistic assumptions. People who, like I were raised in the Christian faith and are trying now in their own worlds come of age to make sense of it intellectually and rationally. I think that radical theology speaks more to them than it does for, say, the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, right? People for whom Christianity is something entirely foreign, who weren't raised religious, who weren't raised in any religious tradition, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, whatever. I think for some of these folks, and I experienced this as a professor of undergraduates for 11 years, the question is not whether God is dead, but whether God was ever even alive. And what is God? What does God mean? I think it's so foreign to their experience that radical or Death of God theology doesn't even make sense to them. That you might really have to, as I did in my courses, make God alive by teaching them some of the essentials of the Christian tradition, and then watch as God is killed or theism is deconstructed by theologians, beginning with Bonhoeffer, but Tillich and Bultmann, and then eventually with Altizer and Hamilton and Rubinstein and others. So I think that's one of the things that I'm realizing. The Death of God maybe only works for people who were raised in these traditions.
Interesting.
And so it's tougher to find how it meets people on the edge of the church and far beyond it.
Yeah.
So in that case, what I'm realizing is that the draw is more contemporary other contemporary issues.
Yeah.
Secularism is less of a concern, and it's more about, right now, for example, we're doing a 4-part series on Me Too in the Bible. I have a former colleague, professor of Hebrew Bible. She's come in and is doing this amazing work in the intersection of the two. And my thinking is, well, then how can I see what kind of intersection, for example, we find in, say, contemporary expressions of atheism and radical death of God theology.
Yeah.
But that's more on the periphery of the church and less in the sanctuary itself.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because that's exactly what I was thinking is, my own experience as also a minister part-time and also a theology nerd, and like really wanting people, even within the church, just anyone really, to really care about kind of nerdy, obscure underpinnings to everything, like the Tillichs and the Bonhoeffers and, all these wonderful names, and really, just like kind of being confused when I would want to teach a class on someone, Tillich or for whatever.
Right.
And people weren't like super into that. And then, coming to the realization, which like, I understand, and I absolutely want there to be more of application and what does this actually mean for our lives, but actually doing that is difficult, taking someone's thought process on these kind of somewhat obscure topics and actually translating them in such a way that it's meaningful for the cultural moment is a lot of work, and it takes, it's a gift, I think. And so, kind of coming to that realization as well and figuring out like, that seems to be much more, people want stuff that's relevant to their life, which is what we say we want to do. But even those of us that say that, it's still, I feel like there's often a wake-up call going like, oh, I'm actually not really doing that. And not a way to do it. And to get out of our heads even more than we think we are, which is why I love being in ministry, because I think that it's a good kind of counterbalance in a sense to my own proclivities. So like that's
and being in the parish, as you know, given your work, is one of the things that I've taken away from William Hamilton, who's really become more of an interest of mine. One of the classic radical death of God theologians next to Tom Altizer and Richard Rubenstein, is that for him, after God is dead, and that needs unpacking far beyond, I'm sure, what the time we have here, but after God is dead, which is not permanent for Hamilton, we follow Jesus into this godless world, and Jesus gives us a place to stand. And my thinking is that the parish can do that as well. It kind of gives us a place to stand, a perspective that isn't simply expressive of the culture around us. And yet, to hear that perspective, what I've discovered is that I can't, like you're talking about, teach theologians. If I talk about Paul Tillich, I have some people who are interested in Tillich after I've talked about him. I have done classes on him in actually a fair number of Lutheran churches in the area, including the one where I'm now pastor. And some people are moved by Tillich's theology, but Tillich is telling us that we should be making the Christian faith relevant. And as he says in response to Karl Barth, you can't answer questions that people never asked. I love that. So the spirit of this kind of ministry, I think, is Tillichian in terms of its method. But the question, as I think I'm hearing you raise as well, is, well, how do we make that work? What do we do to make that occur? If we're theology nerds and people aren't showing up to our discussions on these theologians, how do we bring them in a way that is compelling and inviting, and at the same time exposes them to some of these great voices in say, contemporary Christian theology or 20th century Christian theology? And one way that I'm trying to do that is topically. So this Me Too and the Bible class had a pretty good draw first session, and we're moving toward a final talk that's public. And we did that last spring with a course with a subdiscipline of theology called astrotheology, where people are brought in because of the idea of, well, gee, how does this vast universe and our exploration of it relate to theological claims? The theological claims part was the peripheral piece. People were brought in initially because they were interested in the science. We had a guy from Spaceflight Industries who belongs to my congregation give the first couple of talks. But I think that was enough of a hook, in a sincere way, to invite people then into the further conversation of, well, okay, now that we've talked about this wide expanse of space and this tiny blue dot that, as Sagan refers to, our lovely little planet, what does that mean for God?
Yeah.
And what I thought was really interesting was that a lot of people lingered and they wanted to find out in the remaining classes what that means. And so in a way, I'm kind of realizing this now, we did the correlation method.
Yeah.
We talked about a contemporary issue that raises certain questions and then address that from a biblical standpoint using the symbols, especially the Christian faith.
That's awesome.
So I think there's a way to do it, but I would say of those examples I've given, those are pretty much my only successes. It's tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough. And I have to ask myself too, in terms of the work that I'm doing, well, which God am I serving? It's a good Tolkienian question.
Mm-hmm.
Am I serving the God of church growth?
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, is that a God worth serving? Mm-hmm. Is that an ultimate concern worth having? Mm-hmm. I think it's certainly one that drives maybe some of my, I would say a very few of my colleagues. It certainly drives church as business in this country.
Yes.
And what Mike and I, or what I talked about in my introduction to Resurrecting the Death of God, the pastoropreneurs, the people who are interested in building these big mega churches. And but I have to wonder if that's really what should drive me and what should drive any Christian minister.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, awesome topics of conversation and thought, and really interesting to kind of hear what you've gone through and what you're thinking, and again, a unique perspective. So I appreciate you taking the time to I'm sure others will benefit from it as well.
Well, I hope so. I'm looking forward to more conversation, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, absolutely.